Thank you. I'd like to now move on to our next person with the question. I'd like to invite Dr. Thân.
We have heard from Professor CAO THAYER, Mr. Craig Kelly, and Mr. Quang Lưu of Australian interests in the, what the Chinese call the South China Sea, the Vietnamese call the East Sea, but I prefer a more neutral word, the Southeast China Sea. So we have heard of the interests. And also I think Mr. Craig Kelly mentioned the Australian policy of not taking side of any country. However, I think back in 2012, Professor Michael Wesley of the ANU, in one of his articles, he suggested that Australia should not continue with that policy, given its interest in the region. He mentioned that, of course, America is still Australia's long-term alliance. However, given the unstable policy of the American in the region over the years, he suggested that Australia should form an alliance with some countries in the region like India, like Japan, or even Indonesia. What are your opinions about that suggestion? Thank you.
Our official government position at the moment is that we do not take sides in the dispute, other than we acknowledge there's a dispute there and the territorial claims exist. The reason we're not taking sides is we actually want those countries to get together to discuss that, to use the international rule of law to try and work out what is the best, rather than say we support one side or the other. Sometime down the track, as a nation, Australia, if these international negotiations go on, that we may have to make a decision about which side that we actually choose. And when someone just quickly looks at the map and they see how close China's territorial claims are to the coastline of Vietnam, sometimes it seems very difficult how China could actually maintain that. But going forward, we want to see this dispute brought to the international table, discussed in peaceful, cooperative terms to try and negotiate some type of settlement. And our position may very well be that we would like to see those resources of the Southeast China Sea or the Eastern Sea shared amongst the people of the region, because all of those nations, they need more energy today. They need greater electricity supplies to lift people out of poverty, to create more opportunity and prosperity in those countries. And if we have that, we'll get greater peace. And I think that's something ultimately that Australia may be working for. But at the moment, we simply haven't taken a position because we want to see the dispute, all the parties come together around the table and discuss that. And we take a particular position, that's not likely to happen.
Yes, Dr.
I think it's a great idea that Australia can hold on a little bit and wait for an opportunity to make the decision. But my only concern is that if Australia taking its time for making that decision, China probably already done all their expansion, done all their oil search, and complete their taking over Vietnam as well as that region already. So once that's completed, how is that going to push their way back to China once it's already been done, or the damage already been done?
Well, that's something why we have been critical of China moving their oil rigs. Australia has been critical of that, and we continue to be critical of it. We don't think that's a way to go forward to negotiate this dispute.
CAO THAYER, with the recent news that China is trying to build some sort of permanent structure in the Paracels Island, is that the Spratleys Island, sorry, and the suggestion that America is now too busy. It's got IS to deal with, it's got Ukraine issue, its Middle East policy is going nowhere. It seems it's got so much problems on its hands. So does it have time, would it have the sufficient time and commitment to spend resources in dealing with the problem in the South China Sea or the East Sea? And what about the suggestion that perhaps Australia should be looking at forming strategic alliance with countries in the region, including Indonesia, India, and Japan?
I'll take the last part of your question first and go strategic, trilateral, and quadrilateral. Australia has a strategic partnership with Indonesia. So we already have a developing relationship. And not only is China joining the US and Australia out of Darwin to do a humanitarian exercise, but Indonesia later has already done one. So we've had that. So the trilateral is the US, Japan, and the United States have and meet and coordinate policies. That was seen at this year's Shangri-La dialogue that I attended, and it does lead to robust exercises. Quadrilateral, I think, was rejected by the Rudd government when the three in the trilateral was going to add India, and Australia opted out. India wants strategic autonomy. It's going to be no one's ally. So it's a question of cooperating with India, and the Prime Minister's recent visit, the change on uranium sales, has set that because we're both Indian Ocean countries and we can cooperate. Next, from the bilateral relationships, we can maintain what we've been talking about is the legal position. But if we still have concerns, Australia can contribute, along with its allies, to building up the Philippines' capacity to exercise maritime domain awareness. We can help provide intelligence when that's worked out to give them timely knowledge. We can assist in other capacity building, and likewise with Vietnam, and we do that heavily on the human resources side by training officers here. So the Australia strategy is not really to create formal alliances directed against someone, but it's to create these strategic partnerships bilaterally, trilaterally, and perhaps even quadrilaterally of like-minded countries who share concerns that both cooperate with China bilaterally and as a group, but at the other time maintain a stiff backbone when their core interests are affected.
What about the first part of the question? The US is now being too busy dealing with too many problems.
Well, I was assigned in Australia's national interest to go to the Pacific Command from 1999 to 2002. And when Hillary Clinton and the Obama administration came into office and she proclaimed, "We're back," those of us associated with Pacific Command scratched our heads and said, the United States never left. And although Obama's policy of rebalancing has been accused of being overly military, in fact, nothing has diminished there. And we have repeated statements from Chuck Hagel that the defense budget will not see a reduction in funding. We've seen more the Poseidon 8 reconnaissance aircraft, top of the line equipment, more nuclear attack submarines, top of the line fifth generation jet fighters, all being moved to the Pacific. So that's occurring at the same time, of course, as what's occurring in the Middle East. The difference in policy is the U.S. is not going to fight two wars simultaneously, but it can still, if you will, contain China or balance against it in the Asia-Pacific, and that's unlikely to change for several decades. It's that at the moment, China has not created a specific challenge to the U.S. other than interfering with reconnaissance flights, and that's a matter between those. It doesn't rise up to a major threat. So I think before we write off the Obama administration, remember, we're looking in broad horizons here. Once November comes, he's in his last 2 years of office. And be careful what you wish for. We may have a President Hillary Clinton, and I think China will have to take note of that.
Yeah. Mr. Quang.
Before I get to the substance of the question by Dr. Thân, insofar as what should Australia's policy be in terms of the dispute of the Biển Đông or the South China Sea, I'd just like to briefly answer your question previously about the visit to Vietnam since 1971, the first visit by the chairman of the Chief of Staff of the U.S., General Dempsey. You remember that after General Dempsey came to Vietnam, Vietnam sent Mr. Lê Hồng Anh to China as the special envoy of the General Secretary Nguyễn Phú Trọng. And I'd just like to say the comment made by China Daily, which is the mouthpiece or one of the mouthpieces of China, of Communist China. They compare the visit of General Dempsey to Hanoi and Lê Hồng Anh went to Beijing as some sort of swinging between the two. And the conclusion is that of the China Daily is that Hanoi is going to lose because they can't win both. But that we may debate it later, but I'm not going into the detail of that one. But insofar the question what Australia should follow in terms of policy regarding the Biển Đông dispute or the South China dispute. I mean, to be fair to our Australian government, I'm now defending the government. Australia has taken side, but in a very discreet way, because when Julie Bishop said that every claimant should, number one, refrain from of unilateral action that change the status quo, the status quo. Australia also say that every claimant should refrain from changing the situation, and that the matter should be resolved through peaceful negotiation according to international law, which is totally inconsistent with the position by China. The question is, because they don't say it often enough, they should say, well, look, you must agree to bring the matter to the international court of the law of the sea, which is totally unacceptable to China, but that's the Australian position. But my point is that Australia should take side, which is Australian side, because it's in our interest, in the interest of Australia, to take side to protect Australian interests. You remember, we all remember that in late November 2013, when China unilaterally imposed the air defense identification zone over the East China Sea, Julie Bishop opposed to that position very strongly, because it's in our interest to do so. And she kept on doing that. And now I'm inviting her and Tony Abbott to consider the fact that China has now almost completed the air base on the Johnson South Reef, which in Vietnamese is Gacma, or in China is Chigua Reef. If that is going to be an air base, Chinese fighter can attack Saigon, which is 830 kilometers away, or Manila, which is 890 kilometers away, or Malacca, which is 1,500 kilometers away, or Darwin, about 2,000 kilometers away. So is it not in Australia's interest for the Australian government to raise and to object to that unilateral action which changed the status quo ante in South China Sea? So China, you may have another view.
Well, on the technical side, China is, and I didn't answer that part of your question, is reclaiming land on 6 features. But I've talked to defense analysts in various countries. It's very premature to say, and looking at that current construction, there are going to be air bases and military air bases that could threaten. One, Vietnam has land-based missiles that can go out to that range and strike. It has the Bastion system. Trying to,
that's a deterrent.
As a deterrent, no, but it could also physically strike that if it wanted to. Its airplanes would be closer and operating from interior lines. These bases would be isolated and exposed on long lines of communication. You'd have to store enough petrol, and that could be bombed. The ships could be interdicted that sent supplies. So we could watch this. If I were a desk officer at the Defense Intelligence Organization, you'd watch this very, very closely. But I think it's premature at this stage to see an air base where China is threatening the entire region.
Isn't it a matter of concern, though, when you have
potentially
an area where you have a number of claimants, an area where ownership is disputed, yet one of the claimants is trying to build a permanent military structure right there?
Well, when we don't know that, they're building what's really an artificial island, and that's permissible under international law. And if it fell within the exclusive economic zone of another country, and these don't, then that country has sovereignty over it. These are tiny features. The most you can do is take a former Caribou aircraft, airplane, and land it on those islands at present projections. I can never say no, I can't disprove what they're doing, so I say you keep a watching on it, but at the moment, let's just see where they're going. And China's making the claim, and some of it has justification, that other claimants, Vietnam and the Philippines, have conducted other kinds of construction activities. China's making a meal of it because these are rather minor. They're not on the scale that what China is doing. So what we're wondering is what is going to come out of here? Could it be a liquid natural gas storage facilities, or are they better done by boats? Could they be lily pads for search and rescue, which would be a positive contribution to the region? So we just don't know, and I think it's premature. Now, okay, finally, I would just say what it does seem to do, and China denies this, that it violates the spirit, if not the letter, of the 2002 Declaration on Conduct of Parties to show self-restraint and not undertake activities that would make a settlement more complex. This obviously is, if you're looking at a Chinese game of white and black checkers and you see where these constructions are going, they're very close to Philippine and Vietnamese facilities, and in no way do those countries have the capacity to bring a massive machinery down there to move and create artificial islands on that basis. So in the fullness of time, China will have a greater presence. Whether it's a military one, I think is an open question at this time.
Professor Carlyle, you've been to Vietnam on many occasions and you've had conversations with high-ranking Vietnamese officials. What's your opinion on the apparent policy, the swinging policies? On the one hand, they're trying to shake hands with the U.S. On the left, the big hands of China is still there, and it seems to us that Vietnam is still trying to persist with what's stopping it from taking China to the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. And they've been organizing conferences after conferences which you've been attending. So what's stopping them from doing that?
Well, two things. I think for an Australian audience, Vietnam too has its Hugh Whites, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary, who talks about the China choice as it grows in power, and that Vietnam has no alternative to do that. So the Politburo is divided, and I think in every country in Washington or Australia may not be as bitterly divided, but the crafting of policy always has to have that balance. You trade with China, America's an ally, how do you find the line? In terms of the legal problem, although the Prime Minister said they would undertake, it's unclear, and the Vietnamese have not clarified to me what specific legal issue it is that they would take to the arbitral tribunal. Is it over sovereignty over the Paracels? Is it about the placement of the oil rig? Is it about joining the Philippines? Or even is it just about submitting a statement to a tribunal saying that a particular country has an interest in its outcome, Vietnam itself? And Vietnam would have to be very careful because depending on the issue, China has exempted itself as it signed UNCLOS along with lots of other countries, as was entirely proper, not to engage in those sorts of disputes. But I go back to my earlier point. The South China Sea is semi-enclosed. China and the other countries have signed on to it. They are to engage in cooperation, and they are to engage in conciliation where there are disputes. The Philippines case is merely asking what are their entitlements under international law. Should Vietnam join that? And in Vietnam, one of the things was, it's typical, I think, in some Vietnamese attitudes, let's just wait and see. If the Philippines wins, we benefit. If they lose, well, we have the opportunity of picking up the pieces and launching our own different legal challenge. But at the moment, because China withdrew the rig, the argument really is to what extent would taking legal action undermine the slight improvement, the ability to negotiate and consult with China about not placing the oil rig there next year. And then even if China said it wouldn't, can you really trust them? So that's the road for Vietnam. And taking legal action, once you do it, as the Philippines has done, there's no going back. Once you pull it out, you've thrown away that particular card. So I think Vietnam is just playing a waiting game to seeing what's to its advantage, when to hold that threat in reserve. So if China brings the oil rig back, then they can trump it with legal action, and also to wait. And 2016 is the framework, the first half that year, for a decision by the arbitral tribunal.
Thank you. Let me now move to the next person in the audience. I'd like to invite Mr. Paul Hee Nguyen to put his questions to the panel.
Thank you. Can I address the question to Mr. Craig Kelly? In 2007, when Kevin Rudd was elected Prime Minister, one of the first major prime ministerial overseas trip to go straight to China. 2013, Tony Abbott elected Prime Minister. He went to Japan.
No, Indonesia.
Indonesia. One of the correct me wrong, one of the free trade agreement prime minister visit to the North Asia. The order was Japan, South Korea, and then China. Do you share the view that there is an implied shift in Australian foreign policy toward more U.S. alliance in terms of military and strategic partnership, treating China just an economic major trading partner, and then shifting toward military, and imply, I said, military strategic partnership with our U.S. alliance?
Firstly, on our Prime Minister's first visits after he was elected, we had a lot of work to do to repair our relationship with Indonesia that had been so badly damaged by the previous government, with the live cattle, the ban on the live cattle exports, that fiasco and many other things. So there's a strategic reason why our Prime Minister went to Indonesia to try and repair that relationship. Secondly, we know that our prosperity here in Australia relies on our international trade. We're able to sign a trade agreement, a free trade agreement, one of the first that Japan has signed with any country, that gives Australian producers greater access to those markets. That was the reason why his visit was to Japan. Also to South Korea, we signed a trade agreement there that will see the prosperity of both our countries increase. We're currently working on a trade agreement with China, but we're not going to sort of just sign a trade agreement for the sake of signing it. We want to make sure that's for the best beneficiary for our country. In relation to the USA, we'll always have a strong relationship with the USA. Firstly, because of the historical ties from World War II. Also because we share many same things as the USA there. Respect of democracy, of liberty, of freedom of speech, of the rule of law. For those reasons, our relations are very close with the USA. But with China, we're continuing to develop those relationships. Hopefully, before the end of this term of government, we will strike a free trade agreement with China, adding those to Japan and South Korea, to continue to improve our relationship with China. But that doesn't mean that the improving relationships with China come at the expense of any other country.
Mr. Paul Nguyen also has a question for Professor Cao Thai.
Professor Thayer, everyone knows that I touched on Vietnam issue in terms of the East China Sea. Everyone knows that there is an internal division amongst the Standing Committee Communist Party Politburo members. One is a pro-US, the others are pro-Chinese hardliners. Do you think that with the situation in East China Sea that would allow or would provide opportunity for the human rights movement in the country, we are moving toward a multi-party, or it's just like one of the things that go on and everyone forgot about in the next couple of years?
Thank you. In brief, no. I think we could quibble over whether there's a pro-China, pro-America camp. There might be a group that wants to integrate globally, and the American economy is important for them. The group that has to accommodate with China is like every other country. You can't ignore China itself. What every leader of Vietnam, though, has in common is that the human rights movement, and particularly the journalists and electronic bloggers and others, when they start getting into corruption and family matters, they don't seem to pick one camp, but they pick both. So I hate to say it, and I don't mean to belittle this, they both share an interest in suppressing it. And I would also even go further, that the one camp, the Chinese accommodationist camp, sometimes represses journalists and bloggers to pull the rug out from under those who would move towards the United States. We met in General Martin Dempsey's visit to Vietnam. That just didn't come out of the blue. It was in reciprocation of the visit of the Chief of the General Staff of the Vietnam's People Army. So it was already set up. But just before General Do Ba Thi went to America, a bunch of bloggers was arrested. And that was, to me, my analysis was that was deliberately an attempt to undercut him. He goes to Washington to try to work out military, and what's put on the agenda as he arrives? Human rights suppression. So my bottom answer is no, Vietnam would suppress multi-party. They don't believe in pluralism. They don't believe in multi-party parties. They don't believe in opposition. And on either side of the spectrum, I don't think anybody in the Politburo would grant the ability to have freedom of speech and organization in Vietnam because they have to fear it. They cannot control it, and it would undermine their position.
In other words, they join together because of self-interest to face a common enemy or potentially a common enemy, which is the free press.
Absolutely. I don't want to hog the floor, but I keep asking myself, why do we constantly have these interventions on human rights that constantly destroy the progress that one group would want over another? In other words, that's part of the political system.
Now, Lucy, may I ask Professor CAO THAYER a question? We all know that Foreign Minister Phạm Bình Minh has been invited to go to the U.S. by John Kerry. We know that he has not been able to go, and following the footsteps of another of the Politburo member, Lê Hồng Anh, he is now going to Nam Ninh Quan Sĩ in a week's time. So what is the meaning of Phạm Bình Minh going to China, whereas he was invited to go to Washington?
Well, his trip to Washington is going to take place and he'll meet with Senator Kerry as he attends the UN General Assembly meeting. So it was postponed, there's no question of that. And Pham Quang Nghị, another Politburo member, was sent to sound it out. I was in Vietnam when that decision was made, and they said it was too sensitive because the state counselor from China was about to visit Vietnam, and they didn't want to, they wanted to find out the atmospherics of that visit first. As a result of Lê Hồng An's visit to Beijing, it's clear that there's been like a floodgate has opened, and a whole series of specialized delegations are now beginning to go to China, mainly party to party. And in Pham Binh Minh's case, I think because of the disagreements within the leadership, and he's seen as being favoring integrating and closer more to the America, you send him to China because he has to prove himself. So sending Lê Hồng Anh was great. He was a former public security minister. China knew they could work with him. And the two, when he was minister, he and the Chinese have absolute agreement on how to suppress their own internal dissidents. Pham Binh Minh, he's got like his opposite number. Pham Quang Nghị had to learn about American capitalism. Pham Binh Minh has got to learn about Chinese communism. That's the way the system's working.
Are you saying then that within the Politburo, the forces that still favor close ties with China are still pretty much prevailing?
Well, we've been looking at tea leaves, and analysts are heavily divided. I was given a 9-5 vote when I was in Dong Duc Thang in July that favored taking legal action. But then that, in my understanding, that was before the oil rig was done. So there's a core with a swing vote, a group in the middle that shifts their position. And it's, again, it's to say no one who wants to accommodate with China is pro-China. And it's very hard to do it when China puts an oil rig in your waters. But when the oil rig goes, you wake up, China is there. Vietnam is only a middle-sized province. You share a border. You're $13 or more billion in debt to China. You have to get on and work with it. And so the accommodation is if another faction wants to go running off to the US and China says, there are consequences if you go too far. That's what they have to do. Australia's in a comfortable position. As Bob Carr said, he went to China and tried to educate them on the historical nature of the alliance. Well, in Vietnam, there is no historical relationship, and it's something that China would want to nip in the bud. So it's up, I'm saying it's not one way or the other, it's how to get leadership to agree. They're very cautious. Their default position is stability, not to upset the status quo. And you can imagine the nervous Nellies, I would use Lyndon Johnson's expression. Oh, if we do this, that will happen. And that gets me back to my earlier point about China vis-a-vis this country. They want to habituate Vietnamese leaders before they make a decision to take Chinese interests to account and, if you will, self-censor themselves. Take the action before China has to apply the pressure.
Carl, you are aware, of course, that what Xi Jinping told Lê Hồng Anh at their meeting. Neighbor cannot be moved. No. So you're better to live with and be friendly with China. That is a threat.
Well, that may also be a fact of life, as Carl has mentioned before. I would now like to move on to our audience and their questions.
Dạ, kính thưa quý vị, có phải vì cái nền kinh tế Úc Châu của chúng ta bị lệ thuộc vào tàu, cho nên chính phủ Úc chúng ta không có dám lên tiếng khi Biển Đông đang bị đe dọa. Vì tôi liên tưởng đến giống như một người đàn ông mà bị thất nghiệp, bị lệ thuộc kinh tế bởi một người phụ nữ là vợ của mình. Cho nên người chồng không dám hó hé lên tiếng khi mà bà vợ có những cái quấy nhiễu đối với người chồng. Dạ thưa, đó là câu hỏi của tôi.
Cảm ơn bà Tuyết Trần. The question is first to you, Greg Kelly, and then to Carl. The question is Australia's economy, have we let our economy be so dependent on China that we no longer have the courage or the standing to stand up to China in the face of the threat in the South China Sea? And she is making a comparison. It's like when when a husband let himself so dependent on the wife that if whatever the wife does, whatever the wife says, the man
Agreeable.
just still, you know, just has to put up with it.
I think I'll only get myself into trouble if I go down that track.
I'm translating literally. I don't mean to be sexist, but I think that's the gist of the question.
It absolutely is something that we should be monitoring. It's like, I would put a better analogy, if you're in a small business and you only have one or two customers, you need a diversity of customers. And yes, we're over a third of our exports to China, but that has come about not because we've actually cut back on exports to other countries. It's because our exports to China have actually been growing so much, because China has been importing so much of our coal and our iron ore. That is what has really kicked that percentage up. I don't think that you can see by what's happened with the Australian government, the criticism of Julie Bishop earlier this year, her criticism of China. I can see that, you can see from that actions, we're not actually holding back our relationship with China. We're not actually being told what to do. It is something, it is an ongoing concern. We need, in our government policy, to continue to promote companies to export beyond China. I don't see it as a problem at the moment, but it is something we need to keep an eye on and to monitor.
Carl, is there any opportunities for Australia to diversify its exports rather than being so heavily dependent on China?
Well, one, I think if we just use trade as the only economic measure, we're missing the massive amount of American investment in this country and a very large Australian investment in the United States to put the whole economic relationship together. I don't think we're dependent on the growth of the Chinese economy. When they grow, we sell. When they go down, we suffer a bit in terms of our exports. We also trade strongly with Japan, South Korea, the United States. So it isn't an either-or game. And remember, there's leveraging. China, if it wants to cut off trade with Australia, is going to cut off its own nose as well. So let's take the totality of the relationship. And then finally, as Craig was talking about, if we do get a free trade agreement with China, that also changes the rules of the game. It's more predictable, more legal based, and then it benefits Australia even more. And all the other FTAs have shown, even from the US, which was hotly debated when it was agreed to benefit. So let's take the larger economic issue, the massive role of investment, looking at change patterns, and look at the hopes of the FTA, free trade agreement.
I'm interested in knowing, Australia's been negotiating these FTAs bilaterally. We've got one with the United States, one with South Korea, one with Japan. Now we negotiate another one with China. So where does TPP come in? I mean, if we've got so many bilateral FTAs, do we really need a TPP after all? What's your take on that?
Well, the expression is, from Michael Fromm and the United States Trade Representative, is the TPP is a high quality, a high standard. And it's really aimed ultimately moving beyond the Trans-Pacific Partnership to be a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific. So it has a much larger goal. I hate to, the old sporting analysis, no pain, no gain without the pain. Countries in Vietnam have to reform in considerable ways to benefit from the TPP. And ultimately, you can stitch these together. There's also a regional competitor that China's a part of, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. That's low level. So for countries aspiring to move up, to gain a comparative advantage for where they're strong, individual FTAs can be melded into the TPP, which spreads those benefits, and look at the ultimate goal. So it's a building block, and you have to look.
The FTA free trade agreement is essentially trade on both sides. The TPP aiming at restructure the economy. And this is very important because I quote Hillary Clinton again, it's not just economic, it's also politics. In the sense that if the economy of the members can be restructured and be very productive and coupled with the enhancement of social and other issues like trade union, for example, then TPP is a very good model for the future, if and when it can get past the Congress in the US.
Greg Kelly, there has been some concern from a certain number of members of the Vietnamese community that whereas the United States have been making it very clear, particularly Congress, that to participate in TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, Vietnam has to improve on human rights.
Yes.
It has to allow freedom of labor organization, free labor movement, respect intellectual property, respect labor rights, employment rights. There is some concern that the Australian government has not taken that tough a stance. It has been more accommodating towards Vietnam. It has not been asking for those standards where we will have equal competition between different countries member of TPP. So what's is that the Australian government position?
I wouldn't 100% agree with that analysis. The TPP will be a very important regional agreement, and I think about all the countries that have to gain from that agreement would be Vietnam itself and the Vietnamese people. A lot of the comments and the negotiations of TPP are behind the scenes, that we're not actually putting them out. They're not something that's on the headlines every day, how the negotiations are going. But if we're able to strike an agreement and get greater trade between all those free market economies and all those democratic countries with Vietnam, to open Vietnam up to those ideas as well and the political systems, this can only increase the prosperity of Vietnam. So we need to be doing everything we can to work forward to making sure that we have not only a TPP, but making sure what's actually in it is meaningful and will make significant change.
Dr. Thân, what's the VCA's, the Vietnamese communities in Australia's position on Australia working to join TPP, and particularly any particular standards that Australia should impose or should require for Vietnam to join TPP?
Yeah, as we see, as the condition of joining TPP is very strict, and as Kelly was saying as well, it's if Vietnam is a member of those TPP regional members, then we hope that the Vietnamese people, as well as the people in Vietnam, can somehow have a more better treated by human rights, and the political systems are more open to criticism from the people themselves, and there may be union, there may be more associations that can form, or maybe another political party come along with it. So that could be a benefit as well as to the future of the Vietnam itself. So in a way, the VCA encourage or support this idea, and hopefully Vietnam will be opening up to join this TPP as an agreement.
Thank you. I'd like now to move to our last two members of the audience who have questions. I would like to invite Mr. Nguyễn Trọng Độ.
Cái tình hình đất nước Việt Nam với tại Biển Đông đó, nó đi đến cái thế mà chúng ta thấy là rất là nguy hiểm. Vì vậy cho nên chúng tôi muốn đặt vấn đề là thế giới nghĩ thế nào về vấn đề Biển Đông trong cái tình hình của Việt Nam, là bởi vì người Trung Hoa họ muốn lần lần sẽ cai trị thế giới sau khi mà Mỹ đã mở cửa Việt Nam từ năm 1970 mấy cho Trung Hoa, và bây giờ thì cái thế nó rõ ràng như vậy rồi. Xin quý vị cho một vài ý kiến. Xin cảm ơn quý vị.
Thank you. Cảm ơn ông Nguyễn Trọng Do. Well, thank you, Mr. Nguyễn Trọng Do. I guess the question is got to do with the rise of China. The questioner is concerned that China is not going to be only a threat to Vietnam's sovereignty in the South China Sea, but there is some sort of pattern whereby the threat, if not contained, the lessons of history would not have been learned, and there would have been further implications insofar as peace and stability in the Pacific is concerned, and that would also concern the security well-being of Australia as well. So first to you, Greg, what's your thinking?
I must know, am naturally a little bit of an optimist, and I think the rise of China is a good thing. As China becomes economically stronger, we would hope that it becomes, the democracy will one day take hold in China. We are seeing the sort of two-state system, a communist system with a capitalist business system. I do not believe that that can last forever. I believe there will come a time when China's growth will stall and the leaders of China will realise the way to continue economic growth is to open up those freedoms, open up those human rights, and open up democracy in their country. And if that happens, I believe it will improve the peace, security, and stability for our entire region. So yes, it's an issue that we should be monitoring, but my natural optimistic bones, I like to see that there'll be good outcomes in the end. And I think that we can be confident that that will happen.
Carl, do you share the optimistic feelings of Greg Kelly in relation to the rise of China?
Well, to a certain extent, because I've been involved down at the higher level defense college, and we always end on a futures section. And Paul Dibb, a former very senior defense official, warns against straight line extrapolations. And I'm not criticizing Craig. In other words, that's one possibility, and there are others, and the threat. So Australian planning, both at foreign policy and a whole of government approach, has to look at the risks of each one of those scenarios working out. And I think the next several years are going to be very difficult ones because China's feeling its oats, it's pushing assertively. But at the same time, we're now picking up among the Chinese elite, it's a minority, a counter-reaction of saying what we've done in the South China Sea is gaining us more enemies and fewer friends when it should be just the opposite. And we have to reposition it. So a lot has to do with how China and the US manage their relationship. And Australia's policy is to contribute towards that end. You know, that's the Australian role. It gets access to America. It's seen as an international player by China. It can attempt to do that. So I think the next few years, it's an open question. And it's how the US responds and who follows Obama, quite frankly. And how that's an opportunity then for the U.S. to recast its China policy. I am concerned that the so-called salami slicing, there's the view is that China can keep pressing, and ultimately will change facts on the ground.
Thank you. We'll now come to the last question. I would like to invite Mr. Chương Minh Hoàng.
Last Friday in Hanoi, there were some negotiations for TPP, as you know. And simply that there are some progress for Vietnam position. This is a good sign. However, Hanoi still say no to human rights and no to democracy. What happened? At the same time, I seen in the Foreign Affairs yesterday, David Proud said that, oh, now Hanoi doesn't fear American anymore. So Vietnam can second with American easier. What do you think about that, Mr. Carter?
Well, Vietnam just hosted a meeting of all the TPP partners, and the U.S. Trade Representative will be meeting with Deputy Prime Minister Vu Xuân Ninh, Mr. Ninh. I've just forgotten it. And it's clear he's going into the lion's den because he's going to Washington. And already those people in favor of human rights, democracy, free trade unions are building up. And in fact, and Mr. Quang alluded to this earlier, all this discussion about the TPP in one sense is hypothetical unless we get the Obama administration either to secure from Congress the fast track approach where you have an up or down vote when the TP is finally concluded. So it's a treaty. Or if they don't, it's unlikely to pass the Congress because of the poisonous nature of American politics and sexual interest putting their bits and pieces. So Vietnam could be biding its time, but on the other hand, they're going to find no special exemptions that America isn't so keen to get Vietnam in the TPP. It's going to throw out human rights and other concerns that are already embedded in there. What's being discussed, and Lê Đăng Doanh, a former advisor to the Prime Minister, was suggesting is, and I learned from Mr. Quang tonight that Malaysia also has reservations about trade unions, is to have a phase-in period, a roadmap, that as other countries begin to implement the TPP, Vietnam will take certain steps. So there's wiggle room there. So the larger picture is, can the Obama administration use its political capital to get a Congress to approve it once it's concluded? And the meeting from Hanoi basically said they have a focus program. So yet again, we're being given a short-term time. That remains to be seen. And then Vietnam is going to find no special exemptions by the United States on those core issues. They're embedded in the TPP, and Vietnam will have to comply sooner, or if a roadmap comes later.
Thank you, Professor Cao Thai. We are coming to the end of the program now, but before we conclude, I would like to give each of our guests a minute or two to express your thoughts on this particular topic, and after what you've heard from all the speakers. I would like to start with you, Dr. Tan.
I think my last word is that I think no country, including China, would look for another war or conflict between, or maybe a third world war. So in that sense, we're all trying to hold back and somehow creating a more stable of a region in the Southeast Asia. And in doing that, I'm hoping that one day China will be easing back on this expansion, as well as Vietnam stand up for its own border and security to protect its own people as well. That's what I'm hoping for.
Great, Kelly.
Look, at first, this seems almost an intractable problem. However, I believe, hopefully with negotiations with good international relations, this is something that actually can be sorted out and achieved. We look at the example of China bringing the oil rig down. The cost that must have been to the Chinese government, I think they had 80 warships come down with the oil rig. Surely China must reach a point where it realises the most cost-effective way to resolve this problem is not through bullying or through force, but actually through sitting down and negotiating. If they want to bring an oil rig there, work with the Vietnamese people. Work with them. Do it in cooperation. That's benefiting both nations, rather than just trying to want to steamroll and to bully. That's the type of solution we'd like to see here in Australia, peacefully settled, keeping those sea lanes open, keeping the prosperity of those countries to our north continue growing, because ultimately that's the best guarantee we have of our security here in Australia.
Cao Thai, your concluding thoughts?
Right, well, I agree with the first speaker that when we talk about China threat, don't make the mistake of then saying it's going to lead to armed conflict. I think the chances of that are very, very, very low. China is not using its military, it's using Coast Guard, it's using fishermen, but it's not using the military force, and it always seems to pull back. Two, we're going to enter, I think, into a potentially hopeful period between China and Vietnam, because the visit of the senior Politburo member could well lead to a visit by the Party Secretary General of Vietnam in the fullness of time. And once again, they'll go back to the basic areas of cooperation. We have to watch and see that. I don't want to be overly optimistic on it, but in other words, the oil rig isn't there, and both sides are discussing where to go next, so that will be there. We haven't mentioned today, and I just mentioned in passing, that China, because it's in a defensive position, has then put greater stress on working with the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and they have stepped up their rhetoric. I know they look like they don't move fast, but if you read their rhetoric, they are steeled behind the scene, particularly the new president of Indonesia, to push for an early conclusion of a binding code of conduct. Well, I'm not going to hold my breath, but in other words, China has to show some good faith, because they're being pushed on what's called an early harvest package. As soon as we reach ASEAN and China an agreement on one point, don't put it in a basket and wait till the end to sign it all, but implement it immediately. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we're going to see not a dramatic lowering of tensions. They're still going to be there, but for the next 6 months to a year, working from, I think, the blowback from that oil rig to try to move things back on a more progressive fashion, because China found itself isolated.
Last words to you, Mr. Quang Le.
Well, thank you very much, and I thank the audience for the questions too. I think I agree with Carl in one point and disagree with him on another one. Insofar as the easing of relationship between China and Vietnam anytime the Politburo member or the Secretary General of the Communist Party of Vietnam went to China, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam made concessions. So the easing is paid for by concession by Vietnam, not by China. The key word in Lê Hồng An's mission is to restore. Restore what? Restore the agreement signed by Nguyễn Phú Trọng in October 2011 to exclude anything else but negotiate bilaterally, dictated by China. So I don't disagree with you insofar the easing happening, but it's happening at a cost to Vietnam. That the other one, I agree with you in the sense that in the very unlikely event that there will be a conflict between the US and China, I don't think it would happen. But having said that, I think Xi Jinping is quite a different leader compared with Ho Jintao or Jiang Zemin, because he tried to work up the nationalistic sentiment of the people. He went to the extent that he said the security of Asia should be decided by Asians, which is a Monroe Doctrine in reverse. And he did say that he would never pursue hegemony. But can I believe that? Certainly I don't. So the future, we can be hopeful for it. We can be voting in Australia to choose the government which uphold the value, the law, the democracy, the parliamentary democracy. Why? Because we need that as a strong voice in the matter of region. Without that, I think would be a loss. So the rise of China, you said it's a good thing, you said it can be a threat. I think that is a fact of life that we have to deal with. And we have to deal with among the smaller, medium countries by uniting together to make sure that the rise of China is peaceful and not violent.
Thank you, Mr. Quang Lưu. I think we can definitely conclude that with the rise of China, we all hope for the best, but we do have to prepare for the worst. I think that's, it's going to be hard for anybody to argue against that. Well, the program has concluded. Would you please put your hands together and thank all of our guests on the panel today. Thưa quý khán thính giả, chương trình hội luận và vấn đáp hôm nay đến đây đã kết thúc. Chúng tôi xin cảm ơn quý vị đã theo dõi và xin mong hẹn gặp lại quý vị trong những chương trình hội luận trong tương lai. Một lần nữa xin thay mặt cho SBTN Úc Châu xin trân trọng cảm ơn và kính chào tất cả quý vị.
Well done.
Wow, thank you.